Welcome to another episode of the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Glad you can be here this evening. We are going to take a look at one of those age-old questions, and that is the question of circumcision. You know what happened, of course, in Acts chapter 15, where the Jerusalem Council basically was asked the question, what are we supposed to do when somebody is told that they have to be circumcised in order to be saved? Well, here's the good news is that really the bottom line is very, very simple. You don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved, but there's more to the story than meets the eye, and that's why we're going to take a look at this right now just to get a better understanding of what it's all about. So I have a little PowerPoint I wanted to share with you. Let's go ahead and take a look at this, and we will get a better understanding of what we're talking about here. So let me just go ahead and start this. So really the reality here is that circumcision was never necessary to be saved. I mean, that really is the bottom line. All right, so in Acts chapter 15, we have some men that came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. All right, so the claim is if you're not circumcised, there's no salvation. Well, Paul clearly teaches against this, and I agree with Paul. I'm all in with what Paul says. He says, does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith, which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. Therefore, circumcised, and then of course we see, Deuteronomy 10:16, we see that God says to circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer. All right, so all of this is to show that circumcision is not required for salvation. It has always been a matter of circumcising your heart first. What is done to your flesh, while it has a place and while God himself commanded it, he gave this institution to Abraham and to all of his household. So that means that if you are of the lineage of Abraham, if you are of the faith, then yes, circumcision is something that should happen. But it's never something that is a foregone conclusion that if you're circumcised, therefore you're automatically in with God, because that's just not the case at all. We know that there were ancient civilizations that also practiced circumcision. So the Israelites were not the only ones to have done that, but this is something that was practiced, and what God was really desiring is that what was on your flesh would simply be a sign of what was in your heart. So let's consider a few things, shall we? When we understand here in Acts 21, he says, and when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. So there's this rumor going around that Paul is against the Moses, right? And it says, but they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. So again, there's this rumor going around. You're teaching people to forsake Moses, to forsake the Torah, the Pentateuch, or the law, if you will. So there's this nasty rumor that's going around. And so what James is saying, look, there are tens of thousands of Jews who have believed, and they are zealous for the Torah. So this idea that they could get rid of circumcision doesn't make any sense. So what is happening in Acts chapter 15? And notice here, though, what they tell Paul to do. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. That is the Nazirite vow. Take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. So, of course, what does Paul do? He does this. He pays for their vow, and that's when he gets in trouble in the temple. But he does this very thing to prove that he is walking orderly and he is keeping the law. So Paul again and again tells us that he keeps the law, and then he shows it, he demonstrates it through his actions. All right, so what's going on here? Well, there's a debate that kind of escapes us when we just read the New Testament. You see, in Judaism, this is completely separate from Christianity, from Jesus, from Yeshua. It's separate from anything having to do with the coming of Jesus the Messiah. So in the Hellenistic world, they would have a process for a proselyte. And that process was under some debate. Among the Hellenistic Jews, it says that they would admit Gentiles after having undergone the rite of baptism, that is, regeneration by water. Now, keep in mind, this is not a Christian text. I got this from the JewishEncyclopedia.com. All right, so this has nothing to do with Christianity. And so they had to undergo the rite of baptism, that is the mikvah. And according to the Sibyllines, it says, wash your whole stature clean from impurity in running streams, and hands uplifted to heaven, ask for forgiveness for your doing. Then the worship of God will heal gross impiety. But on the other hand, there was this debate between the zealot and the liberal parties regarding the circumcision of proselytes. So this is somebody who wants to become a Jew, not a Christian, but who wants to become a Jew. And there's this debate that's going on. This is happening in that first century, or the Tanaitic times. So according to Rabbi Joshua, he was asserting that the bath, or the baptismal rite, rendered a person a full proselyte without circumcision, as Israel, when receiving the law, required no other than the purgative bath. While Rabbi Eliezer, who is a more staunch, a tougher kind of guy, he makes circumcision a condition for the admission of a proselyte and declares the baptismal rite to be of no consequence. So here you have this first century debate that is raging between these two different groups. One is saying you have to be circumcised, and the other one is saying no, baptism is enough. Keep in mind, these are not Christians. This has nothing to do with the Jerusalem Council. This has nothing to do with the disciples, nothing to do with Jesus. This is a purely Jewish debate that is raging at this point. So when we come then to our text, of course, in Acts chapter 15, we understand it rather differently. That it wasn't about having to. It wasn't about whether they had to be circumcised as far as God was concerned. Should people be circumcised? Yes, the Bible actually says it explicitly many times. But the question was, do they have to be circumcised in order to be considered a proselyte, to be considered converted into the fold, if you will? Now, also on the JewishEncyclopedia.com, there's another, that article goes on. It says the more rigorous stance seemed to have been inclined to insist upon such converts observing the entire law, with the exception of the reservations and modifications explicitly made in their behalf. The more lenient were ready to accord them full equality with Jews as soon as they had solemnly forsworn idolatry. All right, so if you get that, what's happening here is that there's one sect that is saying you have to take on the entire law. You have to understand it. You have to observe it. You have to, practice it. Of course, you have to get rid of idolatry, obviously, but you have to take on the entire law right away in order to be considered one of us, in order to be considered a proselyte, a convert, saved, if you will. Whereas the via media, that's the middle road, was taken by those that regarded public adherence to the 7 Noachian precepts as the indispensable prerequisite. All right, so that's that's what some people were taking. But the more lenient position was, as long as they had forsworn idolatry, they'd gotten rid of idolatry. They said, I am no longer a pagan. I am no longer practicing idolatry. If you were to do that and say, I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then according to the more lenient position, you were considered a full Jew. Whereas the more rigorous position was, no, you have to not only get rid of idolatry, but you have to now study and understand the fullness of the Torah, and then we will consider you a proselyte. And if you want to become a Jew today, not a lot has changed. They take the very, very rigorous stance that you first have to go through about a year's worth of education to study the Torah. Of course, you have to be circumcised. And then after you've studied Torah sufficiently, and they've tried to dissuade you several times so that you don't become a Jew. After you've gone through all that, then you have to stand before a panel of 3 judges, and they're going to quiz you, and they're going to finally decide whether you are up for it or not. And so what you see then is it's very, very rigorous to become a Jew. And this was exactly the debate that was happening in the first century. And this was not something that was unique to Christianity. This was something that was already alive and well in the Jewish community about what a person had to do to become a proselyte. So again, just to recap, the lenient school of thought was like, hey, just get rid of idolatry, get baptized, you're in. And then, as you then continue to study all the time, you'll get it. Whereas the rigorous, strenuous, strict side was saying, no, no, no. Of course you have to be circumcised. And you have to take on the entire law. And once you've done those things, then you'll be considered a proselyte. So with that in mind, now we can understand a little bit better. So now you have this school of thought that comes in and says, these Jews from Judea, the Pharisees, are saying, look, unless you are circumcised, you cannot be saved. You cannot become a proselyte. You can't become one of us. You've got to be circumcised. And so then the Jerusalem council has a discussion about this. They have a debate. What are we supposed to do? And they say, therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles, those are the would-be proselytes, who are turning to God. So these are people that are wanting to come in. They're realizing that their pagan ways are wrong. They're wanting to come back to God. They want to get right with God. And so the question is, do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to take on the entirety of the law before they can be considered a Christian or a convert or proselyte? Or is it just the basics? So what we see then is they, of course, decide, they take the more lenient approach. They really side with that lenient side of Judaism that says, look, if you do these things, it's enough. All right, so again, here we have it in Acts chapter 15. Therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those who among the Gentiles who are turning back to God. And then I'll explain verse 20 in just a second. But he says in Acts 15:21, for Moses, or that is the Torah, has had throughout many generations those who preach him, again, that's the Torah, in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So what's the point? Look, you don't have to become an expert in the law in order to become a proselyte, in order to convert into Christianity or to, partake in this new thing that Jesus has done. You don't have to do that. Just come as you are. And what does he say? You need to get rid of these 4 basic things. These are the basic things that you are to abstain from. You're to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. So these are the basics, and these are the same things. If we go back just a couple slides, I want to show you again where he says right here, says, wash your whole statue clean from impurity in running streams, and with hands uplifted to heaven, ask for forgiveness for your doing, then the worship of God will heal gross impiety. So that was their consideration. If you've done these things, then you're good and you can learn it. The worship of God, that is worship. Worship is considered by going and studying the Torah. That's what many times a Jew considers to be worship, is to study Torah, to study the Bible, as it were. If you do those things, then that study of the Bible will heal any gross impiety. But just to come in to be considered a convert, you need to wash yourself clean from impurity. And of course, what that would also imply is that you are thereby giving up allegiance to idolatry. Again, another way to put it, Rabbi Joshua or Yehoshua, he's asserting that the bath or the baptismal rite rendered a person a full proselyte without circumcision, as Israel, when receiving the law, required no initiation other than the purificative bath. Well, when did they take a bath? I mean, that's interesting. Well, actually, God does tell them to bathe, to clean themselves before he gives the law. We see that in Exodus chapter 19. They're not to be with their wives during that time as well. And they were not circumcised. They had come out of Egypt and they were a mess. You know, he took them out. They were slaves. They were not keeping his laws for the most part, as far as we can tell. They were a big mess. And so God is then telling them how to have fellowship with him. And so this is what is going on. Again, looking here over this the whole debate, the more rigorous stance seems to have been inclined to insist upon such converts observing the entire law, whereas the more lenient were ready to accord them full equality with Jews as soon as they had solemnly forsworn idolatry. And that's exactly what we see here in our text. In Acts 15:20, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols. That's idolatry. To get rid of idolatry. That's the very number one thing that the lenient side was saying. Hey, if you get rid of idolatry and then you get baptized, you're in. And that's essentially what the Jerusalem Council is saying. So when we look at this compared to Exodus 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Leviticus 17:7, they shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. All right, so that's the first thing. Why is that the first thing? Because when you're coming into a covenant relationship with God, what you're saying is you are now the husband, and I'm going to take that place of the wife. I'm coming into that place of the bride. And if that's to be the case, any other God is essentially like having another guy in the marriage. That's just not going to work. Right? There's going to be the one man and the wife. And so that is the number one thing that offended God. And that's why he divorced Israel, was because they were going after other gods. And of course, their allegiance and worship of those other gods led them to do all kinds of terrible things. But the number one thing was going after those other gods. The next thing, sexual morality. Well, here we have this compared to Leviticus 18, verse 7. The nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness, etc. All right, the whole chapter there is filled with, what you're not supposed to do in regard to sexual immorality. And then number 3, things strangled. This actually packs in the blood. And we read in Leviticus 7:27, whoever eats any blood, that person shall be cut off from his people. And then number 4, from blood. So these are actually quite similar. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. So the disciples are actually giving 4 things, whereas the more lenient Jewish interpretation, just for a Jewish convert, not a Christian convert, but just a strictly Jewish convert, was saying, look, just turn from idolatry, get baptized, and you're in. The more stringent Jewish interpretation was saying, no, you have to become circumcised and you have to take on the entire law before you can even be considered a convert. So really what the disciples are doing is they're saying they're a little bit more strict than the very lenient Jewish perspective, but that they're a whole lot less strict than the strict Jewish interpretation. They're saying there are these 4 things. Turn from your idolatry. Don't commit sexual immorality. Watch out for things strangled. And stay away from blood. Those are the 4 things that they would tell us to do. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you actually take a look at this list, it seems that most Christians are quite quick to stay away from idolatry. Of course, sexual morality is understood. But number 4 is one of those things that we're told specifically to Gentile converts. And yet, this is one of those areas where, I don't know, somehow Christians seem to not be too concerned about this. They think, well, anything is okay for me to eat because Jesus said that everything is okay for me to eat. And yet, that's not at all what he said. So let me just share a few things with you from Mark chapter 7, where it says, then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. That is, unless they wash according to the tradition. Now, when I was in Israel, I remember going into the men's restroom and I washed my hands, and I saw this little wash basin there. It had 2 handles on it, and it is what a Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jew will use to wash his hands. And I thought it was kind of strange because I had seen these before in other places, and I thought, well, that's kind of nice. It's kind of nice for washing your hands. You know, it makes it nice and easy. But then I thought, but why would they put this in a bathroom when there's running water right here? There's soap. I mean, certainly you're getting your hands clean. And I was later, someone later explained to me that no, just washing your hands underwater doesn't count. With soap, that doesn't count. You have to wash in a special way, according to the way that the rabbis or the fathers said that they had to do it. And so they have to take this little cup with the 2 handles on it, and they've got to go this way and this way and this way and this way. And then once you've done that ritual, then you've actually washed your hands. Just putting them under the hot water with soap, that doesn't count as washing your hands. And so this is the same thing that was happening back in Jesus' day. These Pharisees come to him, and they now are questioning why his disciples, when they're eating, they haven't washed according to the tradition of the elders. They're not asking, hey, your disciples just have, dirty hands, they've got germs on them. They're not concerned about that. It's the method in which they actually wash their hands. That's what they're very concerned about. And so this is why Mark goes on to say that they will not eat unless they wash according to the tradition of the elders. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? Again, maybe their hands were clean, we don't know, but they didn't wash them according to the way that the fathers said that they were supposed to do it. That is their issue. And he answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of men, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. All too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. So Jesus rebukes them. He goes right to Isaiah and he says, this is the same thing that's happening. You guys don't do the command, but you now have this extra stuff that you've added on. That was what Jesus' problem was. It wasn't that it was wrong to wash your hands, and even if you wanted to wash your hands in a special way, go for it. But now these Pharisees are saying your disciples aren't washing according to the tradition of the elders, and so it doesn't count. So now their hands are dirty. They're defiled. And so then Jesus goes on, and he says that verse 13. He says, and you making the word of God no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. And this is the important verse, okay, because this is where people get really confused because the Bible translations, some of them have not helped us out very much. It says, there is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. All right, so again, people have jumped on this and said, well, see, Jesus was saying you can eat anything you want. And as he goes on to say in verse 19, he says, well, verse 18, he says, do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? All right, so here's the question. Was Jesus saying that, well, now anything is on the menu? Was that really what Jesus was getting at? If he was, he wasn't being very clear. He was being rather coy. And if he was really trying to overturn the commands that he had given, right? Remember, he and the Father are one, right? They're one in purpose, they're one in thought, they're one in desire, they're one in everything. So what God said in Leviticus chapter 11 about clean and unclean animals, Jesus is not going to say anything different. Secondly, if Jesus needed to completely fulfill everything that was in the law in order to be our Savior, then if he had gone against even one thing in the law, that would have rendered him useless and not a worthy sacrifice. And of course, Jesus said on many occasions, I have not come to do away with the law, but to do it, to fulfill it, to do it, to live it out. And he becomes really the perfect example of how to live out God's law. Now, why do I keep going back to this topic? Is it really that important what we eat? Well, here's my opinion on this. I really believe that we've gotten duped. I think that we have listened to lies, and we love to hear all these other things that kind of tickle our ears. Hear about the end times, hear about the coming of the Antichrist, hear about CERN, and all these other things. But we're dealing with the symptoms and not the root cause. We want to go back to the root cause. We want to get to the very cause and not the effect. Right? Think about if you have a tree in your yard and it's getting out of hand and you're like, I should just get rid of this thing. So what do? You prune the tree. Well, that's fine. You can prune the tree. It'll hold back some of that growth. But if you really want to get rid of the tree, you have to go right down to the roots. In fact, I know this very well because I just did this. We had this really nasty tree in our backyard. It had grown gigantic. It was a bush, really, but it's a nasty bush. We call it the devil's bush. I'm not even sure what it's called, but it had thorns about this long. I mean, they were just crazy big, and I mean, it was just a mean plant. So I cut the thing out. It took me many hours to do it. I got a chainsaw and I worked really hard and I got rid of the thing. I finally burned it all and got rid of it. But what did I see just about 2 weeks ago? I saw little green sprouts coming up from this thing. I thought, oh no. I spent all that time getting rid of that thing, and yet now what is it doing? It's growing back. Because what I did is I got rid of the symptom, and it definitely took care of the problem for a while, but it's already growing back. And that's what we need to do in our own lives. And you see, we can look at all the problems, all the symptoms that are out there and say, well, there's, homosexual agenda and there's abortion and all these other things. And we can point our finger at those as being the problem. But that's not the problem. The problem is that we have strayed far from God's commandments. And when we get back to his commandments, then the ills of society will get better. But not until then. We can pray for revival, etc., but nothing's going to happen until each one of us decides to actually follow all that God has said to do. Now, even if you follow 90% of it, that's better than 20%, right? Certainly it's going to help. But if we really want to see a massive, incredible change in our society, in our lives, in our families' lives, we want to do everything that God has told us to do. And here we come to this consideration of not eating blood. That was what we read there in our text. And now, by comparison, we're looking at this text here in Mark chapter 7. Again, why do I bring this up? Well, I just happened to post a question the other day on one of my Facebook groups, and I asked whether a Christian can now eat blood. And some people said no, but one person said absolutely, because it says in Mark chapter 7 that Jesus purified all foods, and therefore we can eat anything we want. We can have blood pudding, we can have blood sausage, even if it's, not pork, but it's just whatever. And yet, if you were to take that position, you're going to have this huge conflict, because we saw very clearly in Acts chapter 15 where they say to stay away from blood, don't eat it. And they are repeating what is already in Moses, which is already in the Torah. They're simply reiterating that. And then to suggest that Jesus taught otherwise creates this huge contradiction. So Jesus was not teaching that we can eat anything, that pork and shrimp are now back on the menu. Those were off the menu for a very important reason. The reality is that they were never on the menu. They were never on the menu. That's why we see that Noah could distinguish between clean and unclean animals. There were 7 of all the clean animals, and then just 2 of the unclean animals. So Noah already understood clean and unclean meats. And we have to understand that if he had, decided to have a ham sandwich right shortly after the flood, we might not have pigs today. So clearly he knew that he was not supposed to eat those when God said you can eat anything you want. He was only going to eat the clean animals. So here Jesus is not saying that all things are now purified, but it's saying that the body is going to get rid of anything that comes inside of it. It's not saying that all things are now edible, because first of all, pork, etc., God declared to not be food. So even if this whole scenario where Jesus is supposedly saying that everything's now okay to eat, he's not, because first of all, the Pharisees never in a million years would have been thinking about eating pork. That was not on their minds. Secondly, God had already declared that pork and unclean animals were just not food. So when Jesus says that that it purifying all the foods, it's not saying that you can eat this stuff, because pork was never considered to be a food. It just wasn't considered food. Just kind of like we don't consider, vulture to be food, or we don't consider mouse to be food, or we don't consider rats food because we think they're yucky, icky. Dog is not food, and the list goes on of things that are just not food, because they're like, ooh, that's really gross. And that's the whole point. You're not supposed to eat certain things. So the idea that Jesus is actually endorsing the eating of all foods is completely missing the mark. Let me just share one more text with you, and that is from Romans chapter 14. Many people believe that Paul was also saying you can eat anything you want. But what is the debate here? Well, really what's happening is the question of fasting. Are you supposed to fast or not? So for one believes he can eat all things, but he who is weak only eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. This is the question of whether you should fast or not. And then the question of, well, on what days should you fast? Should you fast on day 2 and 5, or maybe 3 and 6? Maybe those are the days that you're supposed to fast. And so there was this debate that was going on as to what days you were supposed to fast. And Paul's saying, look, it doesn't really matter which day you fast on. He's not doing away with the Sabbath, and he's not saying that everything is now okay to eat. He's saying, but when it comes to this question of fasting, it doesn't really matter. If you decide you're not supposed to eat, or if you want to eat vegetables, that's fine. It's all about fasting. And even I'm going to go just one more word, one more verse here for you. This is in Acts chapter 10, and this is, of course, where Peter has his dream. And then the question is, well, you know, God told him to get up and eat a bunch of unclean stuff, but it says that Peter was left pondering what the dream meant. And then he says in verse 28, remember, Peter's the one that had this dream. We should let Peter tell us what the dream actually means. And so he tells us, verse 28, 10:28. Then he said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go to one of another nation. Well, that's not actually in the Bible. That's something that was part of the oral tradition back then. But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So here Peter gives us the interpretation. He now understands what his dream was all about. It wasn't about eating unclean food. It was that the Jews of the first century, many of them, were considering the Gentiles to be unclean and common. That you're not supposed to touch them, you're not supposed to go near them. They were icky, they were like dogs, and you're supposed to just stay away. And so then, Peter's like, I can't go to the Gentiles because they're common, they're unclean. Though the Bible doesn't actually say that, but that was something that was ripe back then in the first century. And so now he understands the dream. It took a radical dream to shock him to say, "Whoa, is that what I'm? That's how I look at these people. I look at them like these unclean animals." And that's exactly what he tells us right here. God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So these are the issues that surround this. Now, we got here because we started talking about Acts chapter 15, where the Jerusalem Council has told us that the converts should stay away from idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. And what I've discovered is that many Christians who think that we've been completely liberated from God's law because it was such a terrible thing, and they come even to this verse, which is given to Gentiles, and they say, well, that was just a transitional period. We don't have to follow that. And yet the text is clear. We should not eat blood. So clearly we should stay away from idols. Clearly we should stay away from sexual immorality. And we should not eat things that have been strangled. And we're not to eat blood. Why? How do they know that? Because God himself said that back in the Torah. Why does this matter? What does it really matter if I eat blood? Well, God said don't do it. He said don't do it. I have a feeling that there's something powerful in the blood. I believe that there may be something spiritual in there. I can't prove that. But just from what I've heard from just various accounts of Satan worship and people that have observed or heard very detailed accounts about sacrifices, human sacrifices, etc. There's something about that. We know that even various tribes that might kill their enemy, it's considered a great honor to actually drink your enemy's blood because you get his life force from him. Can we qualify that? Who knows? But I believe that there's something spiritual that's actually going on there, that we're not supposed to do that. And so we need to be very circumspect about how we read this. We should take this seriously in Acts 15, verse 20. And then coming back now to this question of circumcision. The reason that they said, no, you don't have to be circumcised was not that circumcision is now out, but there was a group of Jews, of Pharisees, who were trying to make it a prerequisite to become a Christian, to become a proselyte. And they're saying, look, unless you get circumcised and you take on the entire Torah right away, you can't become a convert. And the council sides with the lenient school of thought in Judaism, saying, no, all you have to do is get rid of idolatry, stay away from sexual immorality, stay away from things strangled and from blood. And then, of course, be baptized. We see that all throughout the book of Acts. And then you will be saved. Now, it does beg the question, do you have to be baptized in order to be saved? Well, I don't know. Just like you don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. But did God say to be baptized? Well, he did. Jesus said, be baptized. So whether or not you have to be baptized in order to be saved is an interesting question. We may never know. But he does tell us to be baptized. And the same thing goes with circumcision. You don't have to be circumcised in order to become part of the kingdom of God. But if you're part of the kingdom of God, God does tell us to be circumcised. So that is really the bottom line. And this is one of those areas that if we will just obey, we will see God do amazing things. We'll see the blessings that he has in store, and then he'll continue to teach us more. But if we continue to say, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do what God has told me to do, then we're going to forever remain babes in the faith. And this is where we see that in the book of Hebrews, the writer there of Hebrews is really chastising the people there, because he says, by now you should be eating milk, you should be eating meat. And he says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you've come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Therefore, leaving the discussion of the elementary principles of Christ, let us go on to perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God, of the doctrine of baptisms, of laying on of hands, of resurrection of the dead, and of eternal judgment. And this we will do if God permits. So he's saying, look, we really should be moving on. We're still drinking milk. It's time to start eating meat. And if we're not willing to do those basic things that God told us to do, how are we going to learn about the next level? How are we going to learn about these other things? We're going to stay forever at the elementary principles, and we'll never go on to the perfection. We'll never go on to learning the other lessons that God has for us if we're not willing to do that. So we want to go on to learn the word of righteousness. We don't want to remain babes. But it does come down to whether we will be obedient or not. As I've been meditating on this whole idea of why do people hate keeping God's law so much? And my conclusion is that we would rather be a victim. You say, well, wait a second. Well, how do you become a victim if you don't believe God's word? Because you say, it's not my fault. Somebody else is running my life, and I can externalize the blame onto somebody else. It's this person's fault. It's God's fault because he didn't come through. Or, it's my parents' fault. It's my wife's fault. It's my kid's fault. It's my boss's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. We don't want to take responsibility. And when we start to follow God's word and realize that we have an active part in what happens, then we realize that we have a lot of responsibility. And that's when we begin to grow, is when we start to take responsibility. And if we will always keep saying that, no, I can do anything I want now, I don't have to do anything really what God's word says, it's all about grace, and we keep just going back, we're just drinking milk. That's all we're doing, is drinking milk, and we're not growing up. I, for one, would like to grow up. I want to see all that God has for me. And I realize now that I have to be obedient. I'm not trying to earn my salvation. That was a gift from the Father. But now I want to move on to perfection, and it's going to come through following through. So the whole question about circumcision, which is where we started our talk today, is somewhat of a distraction, because it's trying to say that you don't have to do anything, and even these four things, we find that many Christians don't want to even follow those four basic things, because bottom line, we don't want to be responsible. Well, I hope this has helped to understand a little bit better of the role of circumcision. You don't have to be circumcised to be saved. Abraham wasn't circumcised when he believed and was counted to him as righteousness. That's the point that Paul is making again and again. I completely, wholeheartedly agree with Paul in that regard. But the point was not whether you had to be circumcised to be saved, but when you first came in, when you first came to the Lord, what are the basics that you have to do? According to the more liberal, lenient school of thought in Judaism, you just have to get rid of idolatry in your life, be baptized. That's the word that they actually used. And then you'll learn as you go. And that's exactly what the disciples say. That from Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, in every synagogue, on every Sabbath. And so if you'll just get into the word, you'll learn the rest as you go. So the bottom line, come as you are, come just as you are, turn away from idolatry. God will accept you as you are. Come on in, and then start studying the Bible, and then he will then begin to teach you all the rest that you need. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. It's been a pleasure. God bless.